Hello and welcome to Frankly Speaking, where we dive deep into regional headlines and speak with leading policymakers and business leaders. I am Katie Jensen. On this episode, we speak with Dr Varsen Shahin, Palestine's Minister of State for Foreign Affairs and Expatriates. With a new US administration and Saudi Arabia leading a global coalition in support of a two-state solution, could this mark a new turning point for peace and stability in the Middle East? How does the Palestinian leadership view these developments and what is their impact on the ground? Plus, if the conflict does come to an end, who will govern Gaza and what will it take to rebuild? Minister, thank you for joining us today on Frankly Speaking. Now, of course, there is a new US president elected and hopes are high that the new administration can enforce an end to the war and bring back some sort of stability to the region. But frankly speaking, as far as Palestinians go, are you hopeful? And does it really matter who is in the White House?
Thank you very much for hosting me. And to answer your question, I have to be hopeful. We have to remain hopeful because what we have been hoping for a long time, and as always, is a Palestinian state with our sovereignty and our self-determination. And this is what we had hoped for in the past, we hope for today, and we will continue to hope for in the future until such a state materializes on the ground. It is long overdue, and our self-determination is enshrined in international law. This is not something we are begging from the international community. It's something that is our rightful right as Palestinians who have been yearning for this for a long time and who have been suffering under several decades of occupation. With the incoming president in the United States, our hope remains the same. And despite what is going on around us, we hope that President Trump will take a more balanced approach when it comes to the Middle East and puts in his agenda the rights of the Palestinians and the true peace that he always talks about, and that he is able to bring that peace to everybody in the region, not one group on the account of the other, but a Palestinian state that lives in peace and security next to Israel. Because without that, there will be no peace in the Middle East. And the peace, whatever peace he or others think will come to the area, will not be sustainable if the Palestinians' rights are not taken into consideration.
But Minister, there is a very different global climate that the new US administration has to deal with today. I mean, Israel has been condemned by most countries. Saudi Arabia is leading a new global coalition for the two-state solution, which includes many of America's allies and friends. Do you not think that the US would take its global interests into account?
Yes, I think times today are different than they were a couple years ago. And this term for the new American administration is different than before. It's very important to look at the environment, the general environment, look at what happened in Palestine in the past 12 months. The ongoing genocide in Gaza, the mounting pressure and dissatisfaction all over capitals in Europe, the coalition today led by Saudi Arabia on the materialization of the state of Palestine, all that brings to the scene a new dimension that cannot be ignored.
And speaking of the global coalition, tell me, what do you make of the Saudi efforts so far, whether it is politically or financially, to help the Palestinian people? What have been the impacts so far?
I think we're very happy with the Saudi efforts. Saudi Arabia has been extremely important for decades in its support to the Palestinian people. It has a lot of Arab, Islamic, and worldwide weight. And it bears a lot of responsibilities when it comes to the Arab world and Islamic world. and it has been standing with the rights of the Palestinian people for a long time. It is leading the global coalition on the two states, and that's an important lead because of the weight that Saudi Arabia carries. And the summit that was held in Riyadh is a very important message. That summit was a very successful summit. The presence, the 57 countries that were present in the meeting, the decisions that came out of the meeting, the trilateral agreement between the Islamic organization, the Arab League, and the African organization, all points that countries will be moving forward with one voice, one objective, that of end of occupation and in support of Palestinian rights. And most importantly, the normalization issue was very clear in the discussions and in the decisions during the summit and before the summit. Saudi Arabia being very clear about the issue of normalization, that it cannot happen without materializing the state of Palestine, is a very important step and something that pushes forward and brings a lot of hope to the Palestinian people.
Now, of course, the Arab Islamic Summit in Riyadh recently took place, and at it, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman called Israel's practices a genocide. And yet there are still many countries in the West who refuse to consider it as such. Tell me, what do you think it will take to convince them?
Look, I don't think it's about the terminology. I think even if 300,000 people are killed in Gaza, God forbidding, some countries will not call it a genocide. So let's put that aside. What is happening is a humanitarian catastrophe that is acknowledged, and everybody is seeing it on live TV. So the terminology aside, the catastrophe is very evident in whatever is happening. And I think governments and people are more and more realizing that these atrocities cannot continue. So let's not worry about the terminology, although for me as a Palestinian and for the Palestinian people at large, and many of the Arab countries and even some European and worldwide countries are calling it genocide. What is happening needs to stop.
Well, Minister, as you know, there is the narrative that none of this would have happened if Hamas operatives didn't commit the atrocities of October 7. Now, do you believe that Hamas takes the blame for the devastation and destruction and death toll in Gaza?
I think who takes the blame first and foremost is the belligerent occupation that has been suffocating Palestinian lives over 7 decades. Gazans were living in an open-air prison. I'm sure the world at large knows what was the people in Gaza living under, what they were living under, all the impediments and the challenges they were subjected to. And when people as human beings are cornered and they don't see a light at the end of the tunnel, then obviously violence erupts.
Well, tell me, the Israeli army recently released CCTV footage. Now, this allegedly took place between 2018 and 2020, and it showed brutal interrogation tactics and extreme measures that Hamas operatives subjected Palestinian civilians to control them in northern Gaza. Tell me, what are your thoughts? Do you have any comments on this footage?
I think any violence perpetrated by any side is unacceptable, whoever that entity is. And as Palestinians, we need to put violence aside and resort to mechanisms that will bring us closer to our liberation as per international law and the world order, and whatever the world believes we should comply with in terms of getting to the goals that we are aspiring for.
Well, Minister, assuming the war is over tomorrow, huge work clearly still to be done, but who would rule Gaza and exactly what will it take to rebuild it?
To me, as a Palestinian, it's very obvious. Gaza has to return to the Palestinian legitimacy. And as such, it will be the Palestinian Authority that will govern in Gaza. It's very normal and it's a natural development. We're talking about one part of the Palestinian state, which is currently, all of it is under occupation. And invariably, that part should come back to the Palestinian legitimacy. Now, to be able to do that, the Palestinian Authority must be empowered to take its role in Gaza. And by the way, the Palestinian Authority never left Gaza, because even before the war and during the war, our staff have been operating on the Gaza Strip in water, in energy, in social work, in health, in education. So it would be difficult but doable to mobilize our staff to be able to take on the services in Gaza. But the government needs to be empowered to do so. It needs to be able to enter Gaza and work on the ground. And we need all the support we can get to be able to shoulder all the relief efforts that would be needed, and then the rehabilitation, and let alone the reconstruction. And the needs will be extensive. I mean, after all the massive destruction, the killing, there's no life in Gaza. Everything needs to start from scratch, and you can imagine the financial support that would be needed, and you can imagine the human resource support that will be needed. It will be first and foremost Palestinian brains and human resources who will be shouldering this, but there would be a need for a lot of support from the international community.
Well, let me get your thoughts on some recent comments from American journalist Thomas Friedman. Now, he is no friend of Prime Minister Netanyahu. He said that the establishment of a Palestinian state would be conditioned on the Palestinian Authority undertaking reforms to make it a governing body that Palestinians trust and see as legitimate, and that Israelis see as effective. Now, such changes could also lead to the normalization of diplomatic ties between Saudi Arabia and Israel, he said. Tell me, what are your thoughts on that?
You know, the Palestinian reform is a Palestinian demand. We want to learn from our past experiences in managing our organizations. We want to develop our organizations. We want to use best practices in dealing with our human resources and the finances available to us. So the question that needs to be asked is, even if we go by the book and we do all the reforms needed, will that ensure that we get to our political aspirations? I mean, if tomorrow we wake up and we see perfect organizations, no problems whatsoever in the management, we do all the reform demands that are asked of us, will that end the occupation? Will that end the genocide in Gaza? I'm sure that will push in that direction, but focusing on that as the prime issue, I think it's diverting us from the main problem. The main problem is the occupation, and once the occupation ends and Palestinians see that they can be liberated from that suffocation and can turn to looking towards developing their systems, Palestinians can thrive and they can move on and contribute not only to Palestine, the region, and the world at large.
And of course, as much as we're talking about Gaza, since the eruption of the crisis in October, specifically in Gaza last year, there has been an alarming rise in settler violence in the West Bank too. How does the PNA intend to address this challenge and protect Palestinian citizens and communities there beyond just making appeals to international organisations that are located in the US and Europe?
I think primarily we need to continue with our appeals internationally, because we don't want to go into a field conflict with the occupation. I think that will draw the whole area to eruption, and it's a situation we don't want to reach to. The unleashed settlers in the occupied Palestinian territory are committing violations on a daily basis. They have been before the Gaza genocide, and yeah, as you said, the violations are spiking. They are on the increase, and we see them doing all sorts of things. And now we have the olive picking season, and olive pickers are attacked on a daily basis. The picked olives are confiscated, pickers are beaten. We see violations in burning farms, in burning trees, in attacking our cattle and poisoning cattle, in throwing stones at trespassers. So of violence is perpetrated against us. And these settlers are green-lighted by settlers themselves who are ministers in the government. And they will continue with their violations unless entity or the government itself stops them, or the army, the Israeli occupation forces, them. Because in incidents, we have seen the army behind the settlers just watching. It needs a lot of work. The international community has a lot of responsibility. They see what is happening. What is happening is violations of international law, is violations of the rights of people under occupation, and the international community needs to raise its voice very high, because if it continues with its inaction and inability to stop the genocide, stop the Israeli settlers, then who will be able to stop them? And if these two major actions by an occupied state are not stopped, then Israel will continue to do whatever it's doing, not only for the Palestinians, but beyond Palestine.
And frankly, it feels like the conflicts in Gaza and Lebanon have distracted attention from the West Bank, allowing Jewish settlements to expand. Now, President-elect Trump's nominee for the US ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, he is so ardently pro-settlement. He even uses terms like Judea and Samaria. With that in mind, do you see any realistic way for the PNA to actually reverse the process?
I think it will be quite challenging, but we need to keep lines open. And we need to do whatever it takes to bring to the table, first and foremost, international law and the world order. And this international law is applicable to all. It's not divisible. All have to comply with this law, including Israel, which should not be considered as a country above the law.
Now, another growing concern, we've heard calls from Armenian Christians of Jerusalem. They're saying their community is facing an unprecedented threat. It stemmed from a legal dispute over a real estate deal in the heart of the Armenian quarter. Now, do you believe that the deal is part of the Israeli far right's goal to push non-Jews out of the old city?
Very much so. I think whatever is happening in East Jerusalem, specifically in the old city, is part and parcel of Israeli Judaization measures, of pushing people outside. Now, the Armenian quarter is a very important quarter and very strategically located in the old city, and the land in question is invaluable. I mean, if the Israelis claim that they have paid an X amount of dollars, that land is worth 100 times, if not 1,000 times, more than they claim they have paid. So this land is part and parcel of the heritage of the Armenian people for decades in Jerusalem, and one that they will continue to take pride and they would want to continue having for generations to come. It was not owned by the Patriarchate, and nobody had the right to rent or sell that piece of land. That's why the community has taken the case to court. It is being discussed in court right now, and we are hopeful. The community has a very good team of Israeli lawyers, along with international lawyers who are working on the case.
Is there even the slight possibility that the Armenians will actually win their court case and Israel be able to hold on to this highly valued piece of property and ensure that such a crisis does not happen again?
Yes, I think what we hear from the lawyers from the United States and locally, there's a very good chance to revoke the sale.
Well, let me get your thoughts on this, because in the 20th century, the Christian population of the Middle East was roughly about 13.5%. Now, by 2020, the population has plunged to just over 4%. And in fact, in the coming years, by 2050, experts predict that less than 3.5% of Christians will remain in their ancient homeland. Why is this happening when Israel's Christian population is constantly increasing?
This is happening because, for example, if you live in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and you are under occupation and you want a better future for your children, then you would opt for opportunities outside. And we know that the Christian population is quite educated, it's quite exposed, they have relatives abroad, and it's much easier for them to immigrate. They don't immigrate because they want to. And they don't immigrate because the percentage of immigrants is not higher than the Muslim population, for example. It's about the same. But people are sick and tired of occupation. They want a better future for their children. This better future cannot happen under occupation. Uh, this day in and day out has drained people, and they just want to live a normal life. So the answer to the Christian presence and the steadfastness of Christians in the Holy Land and elsewhere in the Middle East is with the end of occupation, because with an end of occupation, there is an economic horizon and there is a future that people can look to rather than struggling and day out to make it under this brutal occupation.
Well, Minister, let me ask you one final question before we go. As we know, 2024 is quickly drawing to a close. It's almost over now. Do you believe that we will finally see a Palestinian state by 2025, or does that feel like it's more out of reach than ever before?
At face value, it's further away, but I and most Palestinians have to every day say that this is doable. This will happen, because at the end, justice has to prevail and the Palestinian rights have to be upheld, and the international community has to look at the people who have been suffering for such a long time with more respect to their rights, their self-determination, and the rights as enshrined in international law. If it doesn't happen in 2025, it will happen in 2026 or 2027. But we have to stay hopeful, because this is an issue of rights. It is not something that we are begging. It is something that international law gives us, and we will continue clinging to that.
Well, Minister, thank you for joining us today on Frankly Speaking. We do appreciate your insights. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.